hopefully that is all making sense. Please let me know if there's any questions in the chat. But with biodiversity, we're thinking about that now, kind of going on from that. So this is a really big one where you have to know all your definitions. There's a lot of separate terms, I want to say. So knowing your, having your glossary and kind of keeping that up to date is important for something like this. I would say biodiversity is a little bit more straightforward than some of the other stuff we've looked at, particularly, your complex processes of meiosis, mitosis, and your chromosomes and all that. But don't let that kind of lull you into a false sense of security, because again, the main thing with bio is being able to answer your questions properly. And with biodiversity, it's a lot of application questions. So it's a lot of, here's a nice chunk of article, here's a lot of reading to do. Now tell me about this, and apply this in an unfamiliar setting. And that's something that practice questions are really, really important for, which I'll talk a little bit later. Okay, so in terms of your definition here, closely related organisms that are similar to each other and usually capable of producing fertile offspring. Next year, in 3-4, you talk about the definition of species again in this context of when one species becomes two, when animals become different. So this idea of producing fertile offspring is a really important definition, because that's a way of figuring out if species are different. So I think if you think about a mule, which is a donkey and a horse, I believe. So a donkey and a horse, they can mate and they can create a mule. And that's great. A mule can be, a mule is fine. It can be used for different things, or it's fine. So it's viable offspring because it can live. It doesn't die instantly at birth. But the reason why horses and donkeys are two different species, I think it's horse and donkey, are two different species, is because mules are not fertile. So a mule cannot mate with another mule and have offspring ultimately. So that's the idea of why they're two different species. So it's a really important definition to understand. Okay, so again, as the name suggests, biodiversity, it's just the diversity, the variety of organisms on Earth. So biodiversity, again, is something that comes up next year when you look at this thing, to do with speciation and all this sort of stuff. But the idea here is that the more biodiverse something is, the better. The more genetic variation, the better, as we've discussed previously. So the way for things to be biodiverse is a large population. If you have a small population, you're not going to be as genetically diverse because you have less members ultimately that have less different, characteristics. At the same time, you can have a large population and they can all be genetically similar, which isn't that good. But generally, the larger the population is, the more alleles you've got in there, the more they're mixed around, the more they're different. That's beneficial. And the main thing from this is that the species is more likely to survive. Because again, the large population, you've got large numbers there. So if you got something that's going to wipe a lot of people or organisms out, you're kind of safe. But at the same time, if you've got a disease and it targets this sort of, not targets a specific gene, but if you have certain members of the population that are susceptible, if everyone is pretty different in that group, then it means that some people will be susceptible to this disease, but other organisms in that population that are genetically quite different, they may be immune or not susceptible, is the idea there. So they're less likely to go extinct. So that's a really, really big thing with biodiversity. So in all your short answer questions about biodiversity, that's what you're going to want to be talking about. The idea of survival, the idea of going extinct. Really, really important. Include that in all your short answer questions. And the last point, so being genetically diverse allows a species to adapt to changing circumstances. So again, this idea, if you've got a disease and it's coming through, we'll talk about natural selection in a second, but this idea of you've got sort of survival of the fittest. So if you've got, a large population, organisms that all are capable of different things, that are all suited to different things a little bit more than others, that means that if a disease comes through, if the environment rapidly changes, if a new predator comes, all these sorts of things, Because individuals are diverse, you've kind of got at least parts of the population that will be able to survive in whatever circumstances, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so strategies for maintaining biodiversity. I'm sure you're all aware of this idea of, declining biodiversity and ways to improve and maintain that. So this idea of tackling climate change, obviously with climate change, you're seeing, decreased habitats, you're seeing destruction of environments, and obviously that negative consequence on plants and animals. This idea of overexploitation, decreasing pollution. So this idea of human sort of habits almost. So, industrialization and creating housing and things like that, and obviously the use of transport, all, important and beneficial to humans. But the idea is that biodiversity is suffering as a cause of that. So kind of being aware of things like that, conserving species, conserving habitats, and then management of invasive pests. So if you bring in an introduced species, and this idea of it kind of wiping out certain organisms, because of this idea, it's basically like a disease. Because if you think, like, if you are bringing in a disease that nobody has ever had before, nobody has ever been exposed to it, you don't have immunity to it, and you're going to get really sick, and everyone's probably going to suffer, right? They're all going to be susceptible to it because they don't have any previous immunity. It's sort of the same thing with these invasive pests. If you bring in these foreign animals to different habitats, to different ecosystems, these animals haven't seen this before, and they're likely to be quite vulnerable to changes that those pests create in that environment. Okay, so adaptations, this is an important thing as well. Again, it's very application-y. VCAR doesn't want you to look at a billion different species of organisms and remember all of their adaptations. It's this idea of you're probably going to get an animal, you'll get a scenario, you'll get a description of a certain characteristic they have, maybe a certain description of a characteristic that a different, organism has, and then why one's better suited to the environment. That's sort of the common question that you might come across. You should know the different categories as well, if it's a behavioral adaptation, if it's a physiological adaptation, if it's a structural adaptation, and how, again, it benefits the organism and how it allows them to survive. So behavioral, we're often thinking about things, to do with mating, like a certain call or a certain, dance. Sometimes you can see with birds and like tropical birds and things like that. These are behavioral adaptations because they increase the likelihood of mating, and obviously that increases the chance of offspring survival. Physiology, so kind of the idea of the almost the genetic makeup of a certain organism. So for example, if you have a longer, what we call like a loop of Henle, so in your kidneys absorb, they do a lot of things, but they absorb water, right? So if you're in a really dry environment, if you've got a longer loop of Henle, you can absorb a lot more water and you can stay more hydrated compared to another animal that may have a shorter loop of Henle. They won't be able to stay as hydrated in this dry environment. So that's kind of physiological example. And then structural, maybe you're thinking about, size or shape of wings, or, color of fur or something like that. So adaptations develop due to natural selection. So this idea that the whole sort of species or this whole group of organisms can change over time is this idea because, again, it's survival of the fittest. So if you've got some organism that has a long loop of Henle and another that has a short one, the short one is more likely to die because they're going to be less hydrated, whereas the one with the long loop of Henle is more likely to survive, and more survival time equals more breeding time equals more offspring. So then over time, you're going to start to see these organisms generally have longer loop of Henles, and this idea of it being an adaptation that develops over time. Because again, survival of the fittest is this idea that if you've got something that's more suited to this environment, it's going to show up more because they're the organisms that are going to be living longer and breeding longer. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Again, these are just some other specific adaptations for this animal, but you would want to be thinking about, behavioral, are they physiological, are they structural? Okay, so here's an example of natural selection. I've kind of mentioned it with this idea of adaptations previously. This is the classic example that comes up everywhere. I'm sure you've heard of it before, but this idea of peppered moths in England. So it's important to understand that natural selection is separate to evolution. You cover evolution in 3-4, Bio 3-4 next year. Natural selection is different to that. They are intertwined and they can contribute to this process, but it's a little bit different. So just be aware of that. So going on with this example of peppered moths. So before the Industrial Revolution, you have this picture here, and this is kind of post-Industrial Revolution. So the bark of the tree is white. So you can see the moths here. The moths here that are white can camouflage more easily. So this main predator, this bird, you're looking against a white background, you're more likely to see these black moths, and that's what you're going to eat at first. Therefore, if we think about natural selection, over time, you're going to see more white moths than black moths, because these white moths are kind of, they've got an adaptation. They're adapted to live in this environment because they're camouflaging better, compared to these black moths. Oh my gosh, black moths, which stand out. So that's the idea. Before the Industrial Revolution, if you think again about survival of the fittest, the white moths were the fittest because they camouflaged the best, and the black moths were just being eaten left, right, and center. So during the Industrial Revolution, after the Industrial Revolution, you've got all of this ash, smog, smoke going around, and it's making the trees darker. So now you've got what we see here, these really dark trees. So now it's reversed, right? The black moths are camouflaging in really nicely. The birds struggle to see them. Whereas these white moths, which used to be at an advantage, they're sticking out, and they're really obvious to see. So these birds are obviously going to eat them all up, and their numbers are going to dwindle. While the black moths, their numbers are going to increase. It's what we've just talked about before with that dehydration example. The one that is not camouflage, or that's not suiting its environment as well, so the white moths, they're going to die because they're going to be eaten, and that means they've got less time to produce offspring. Whereas the black moths, they're camouflaging, they're hiding really well, they've got more time to produce offspring. And what that means is they've got more time to produce offspring that look like them, so they're producing more black moths. Whereas the white moths, they've got less time to produce more white moths. So that's the idea there. You can see how ultimately over time, you're going to get more and more black moths. So that's what you can kind of see here. So as the trees became darker, the population of moths became darker. And that just carries on for generations and generations. And then over time, the white moths are really kind of gone. Their numbers dwindle. They're in really low numbers. Because again, thinking about adaptations, they're not suited for their environment. So that's where you can kind of understand the name as well. So natural selection, it's this idea of you have this sort of pressure in the environment, this almost selector in the environment, which is in this case your predator. It might be a disease, it might be the weather, it could be a lot of different things. But you have this environmental pressure, and it forms the basis of who survive and who don't. So this predator is going to eat those who are less suited to their environment, is basically the idea there. Natural selection questions. Natural selection is on the syllabus again in 3-4. So this is a really important example of something to be on top of. Typically in 3-4, the questions will be like 3 or 4 marks on natural selection. So I always tell my 3-4 students to plan their answers on natural selection. This is something as well, again, I'll talk about it at the end, but planning your short answers can really help you out sometimes. And when you've got a 4-mark natural selection question, this can be a really, really important example of doing that. So you want to discuss this idea of there being variation. That's your first step. So the first thing you would talk about is within the environment, and again, this goes for peppered moths, this goes for any natural selection question that you get, there's variation. And VCAR will be very obvious in the way that two organisms are different. So here you would say there is naturally variation. So some moths are just naturally darker colored. Some moths are naturally lighter colored. And that's just a variation that exists. The second thing you talk about is this idea of this environmental pressure. So you have your predator and this idea of camouflaging in the background. So you've got your black moths, which are camouflaging more. They are less noticeable to the predator. The predator is more keen to eat these white moths because they're more visible. This results in the black moths having more time to survive, more likely to survive, and more time to reproduce, more time to pass their alleles. This is something that you say as well, like they pass their alleles or pass their traits onto their offspring. So they survive, they reproduce, and they pass down their alleles. And that means that over a few generations, the population starts to look more like them. You get less white moths and more black moths. And then basically that's the idea of natural selection. So the whole idea is that over time, this allele becomes very prominent in the population. So I think that's like there's like 3 or 4 points to remember, and that's ultimately to get your 3 or 4 marks. But a big one is always that first one, talking about variation. So that's an important thing to understand. Okay, so looking at relationships, you've got relationships between different organisms. So this idea of your ammentalism, your mutualism, etc. So some examples of this. So cow steps in mud, which kills a group of insects and plants in it. So ammentalism is this idea of when you've got one group that is ultimately being harmed, and then the other that doesn't really have an effect. In terms of commensalism, this idea of some birds living in the hollows of trees. So this idea of your protection offered there to the birds. You've got one benefiting and the other not having an effect. In terms of your mutualism, both benefiting. So bacteria in your human stomach feeds off nutrients that the human eats. So again, you're both sort of benefiting from that. Leeches suck blood out of hosts is your parasitism. So obviously parasite, you've got one is benefiting and one is harming. And your predation is basically predatory. So you just eat the other organism really. Yeah, but hopefully that makes sense. The ones that come up the most, I'd say, is like predation and your mutualism. Ultimately, that idea of both organisms kind of benefiting, so mutually. So you can see like bacteria feed off nutrients and they're favorable to humans as well. And then some of the others are really just the other party just doesn't get hurt. Either one benefits and the other doesn't care, or one dies and the other one doesn't care, is what you can kind of think about there. Okay, this is your little food web that's going on here. So you can see that you've got it's like a food chain or food pyramid, but a little bit more matched up. So you can see you have your like your producers and your consumers basically. And it's just important, again, it depends on your teacher, it depends on your SACs, but often you're asked to interpret them as opposed to drawing them, but you may be asked to draw them as well. So in terms of your arrows, it's the idea that you're pointing towards the organism that's eating the other. So your grains are eaten by your birds, which are eaten by your foxes eat your rabbits, which eat carrots, which eat grass, etc. So it's just important to understand the way that the arrow goes. But yeah, pretty self-explanatory. In terms of your energy pyramid, so we just talked about your producers and your consumers. So you've got your kind of apex predators at the top and your primary producers at the bottom. Your primary producers are, your plants, your things that are going through photosynthesis, so absorbing the sun's energy, and they're converting that into their own stored energy. Every time that something consumes something else, 90% of that energy is lost. So your consumer here, so you've got your rabbit that eats your carrots, they're getting 10% of that energy. Your foxes are getting 10% of the rabbit's energy, which is 1%. Oh, is that right? Yes, 1% of the carrot's energy. Hopefully that sort of makes sense. But it's this idea that as you go up, you lose a lot of energy going up that sort of food pyramid. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. In terms of keystone species, so keystone species are, again, as the name suggests, they're very, very important, and any fluctuation in their number will affect the kind of entire food web, or will affect the other organisms in that ecosystem a lot. So often we're thinking of predators here. The idea is that they have a really big influence, but there may be only a select few of them. So if you have a predator and this predator just sort of dies, you will get a big change in the ecosystem. So let's say that like foxes die, maybe, I don't know. Let's say that foxes die. You've now got a huge number of birds. You've got a huge number of rabbits because they're not being eaten by anything. Now your carrots are dwindling, your grasses are dwindling, your grains are dwindling, that sort of thing. Your grasshoppers are going to dwindle a lot as well. Your owls will suffer as well. So it's this idea of foxes are gone. Now there's heaps of birds. Now there's a small number of grasshoppers because the birds are eating them all. Now the owls are suffering because of that. Now there's going to be a smaller number of mice, and so on and so on. So that's the idea of why they're keystone species, because a fluctuation in their number will completely or will cause a really large fluctuation and a large change in that ecosystem. And so it's that idea of other organisms being dependent on their numbers. Okay, so kind of going on from that, what impacts population? So you've got predation, obviously, competition. So again, if you're introducing these invasive pests, other organisms that are competing for the same resources, that's going to cause a fluctuation as well. Disease, trans-environmental events, obviously the number of births. So with predation, we're thinking about like the number of deaths, births as well, in terms of migration and resources. So these are all very intuitive as to how they would impact populations, but it's important that you can, again, apply. So if you're given any sort of scenario, being able to understand, oh, okay, they're talking about migration, okay, they're talking about competition. Now I'm going to write about this and mention how it affects a population. Okay, so a little practice question just to finish off our content. Unlike many domesticated animal species, sheep have a diverse gene pool. The merino breed of sheep is particularly diverse. This means that the merino breed of sheep what? So again, this is an example of sometimes distracting or unnecessary information. Sometimes you'll come across questions and they might look, I'm not saying that this looks hard, but you'll see foreign information and you might go into a bit of panic. So you might see something like the merino breed of sheep and think like, oh my gosh, I've never heard of this before. I haven't done any research on this breed of sheep. Or, you might get a bacteria you've never heard the name of. You might get a long little article about something that you've never heard of before. It's not always necessary. Like, for example, with this, the merino breed of sheep is particularly diverse. This means that the merino breed of sheep, blah, 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 blah. If you break this question down, it's literally just asking you what is something that is true of diverse populations. So try not to get too caught up on information that, seems foreign to you. Obviously it's different. If you get a big chunk of information, you need to comprehend it and understand it, but you don't need to know every single thing. Often VCA will use things, like this, just as a bit of added context, or even to, trick you or mess you up a little bit. But if you just break the question down, it'll be something that you know. You'll never get a question, or at least your teachers shouldn't put a question on your SAC or your assessments that require knowledge that, is too specific or that you haven't been taught. Okay, so has been through a genetic bottleneck. So no, I know we haven't talked about bottlenecks and stuff like that today, but if something is diverse, a genetic bottleneck is basically like a decrease in genetic diversity, so that wouldn't really make sense. Will be very susceptible to infectious disease. No, in fact, it would be the opposite if you're particularly diverse. will show a high frequency of genetic disorders. Again, no, because if you're particularly diverse, genetic disorders that certain individuals have shouldn't be that prominent in the population. For example, there are populations where if the gene pool is small, or for example, they may migrate and start their own population. So if you have, let's say we've got this nice big population of 100 people, 5 people leave and go to this other little area and they start, making their own offspring and they have their own little population that's separated. Let's say that 3 of them had a certain, characteristic. You could say like they had the same colored hair, or in this case, let's say that they had a genetic disease. Obviously, if they are basically the core of the alleles in that gene pool, as they have children, all of those children are going to have the same genetic disease they had. It's kind of what we were talking about before in terms of, if you've got homozygous recessive parents, they're going to have homozygous recessive children. It's sort of that idea there. So that's where you'd see a high frequency of genetic disorders in those sort of scenarios where you've got a really limited gene pool because it may have started from only a few people. So then obviously that leaves the last one, which is D. Has a good chance of surviving environmental change, which again is true because of the things we talked about. They're less susceptible to infectious disease. You've got different adaptations that can be suited to different changing environments ultimately.